Yeah, I'm allergic to pulpits. You wouldn't think so, given that I wear this green clergy collar. This is because I'm committed to the greening of religion. I'm committed to honoring the biosphere as divine, as a greater thou, not a lesser it. And so the title of my lesson, my presentation this morning, sermon, whatever you want to call it, homily, is the big picture. What every grandparent, what every child, what every young person, the title was, what every young person and grandparent needs to know, but it's really all of us. And by the big picture, what I mean is what traditionally religion has known as their creation story. Their story that explained where things came from, why things are like they are, where things seem to be headed, what's more important than us, like what's sacred, what's holy. That's really what sacred means, is it's more important than me. It's more important than us. It is to be cherished. It can't be bought or sold. Something is not sacred if it can be bought or sold. And so one of the fundamental things that we learn about the big picture that is vital for young people and grandparents and all of us to know is that there is a fundamental difference between living faithfully and living unfaithfully. Faithful to reality, faithful to God, faithful to the universe, faithful to mystery. Faithful to what is undeniably and inescapably real. Faithful to the green world. Faithful to our kin, the other creatures. So the fundamental stance that we learn from a science-based, purely science-based, but also enriched and nourished by the mystical traditions, by the heart, by inspiration, is this understanding of the fundamental difference between faithful cultures, we call them sustainable. That is, those that can live faithfully for many, 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 many generations without despoiling or degrading everything they depend upon, the air, the water, the soil, the forest, the life upon which they depend. In other words, they treat the body of life as if it's God, as Gaia. And the most important thing in sustainable cultures is to preserve the way of, well, first, to learn the way of life, the Dowd, the way, spoken of in different traditions. But how does life work? How does the rhythms and cycles of life work within a nested reality? And this is one of the things that we understand through science in a different way than indigenous peoples. But I so appreciated, Janet, the reading from Robin Wall Kimmerer, because I love Robin Wall Kimmerer's book. It's currently, I think, number 3 on the New York Times bestseller list, Braiding Sweetgrass. And the fundamental stance of indigenous, truly faithful, truly sustainable, is we belong to the land. The fundamental stance of unsustainable, unfaithful civilizations is the land belongs to us. And so it's sometimes referred to in indigenous cultures as a kin-centric worldview, where the living world that we are, as Daniel Wildcat, a Native American elder, speaks about it, he said, we are surrounded by relatives, not resources. And so this idea of preserving the well-being of the air, water, soil, and life upon which you depend, and learning how to do that so that you can teach the seventh, that you can teach your children and their children so that it can go out and basically that everything we depend upon, air, water, soil, forest, other life, is preserved, the quality. It's the opposite of extractive, where we take from the living world and we exude a bunch of waste, and then the systems start winding down when we go into what's known as ecological overshoot. And that's the difference. The first 95% of human history, we lived more or less sustainably. The last 5% of human history, we've had over 100 boom and bust, rise and fall, progress, regress. And that's the nature of the reality in which here now we are, in a civilization that's not just contracting, in a biosphere that's not just collapsing in terms of the quality of the health of the soil, the water, the forest, the life, and everything else, But we happen to be alive in the time when we became aware of it, and now things are on the down, and how to be with that. And so that's what, see, this is the thing. Young people, children, they just live in the present. They don't have all this mental baggage that they got to carry about, why me? Why us? Why now? They just live, it's like children kind of have this, okay, here's what's real. Now, what's possible? And living out of that place of possibility, given whatever's real. And the truth of the matter is, living in times of expansion, in civilizations and empires that are expanding, usually by degrading the living world, and everybody isn't benefiting. The slaves in slave society certainly didn't. But as I said, we have over 100 examples of rise and fall. And on the way up, when we're using more and more energy, more and more resources, and the living world hasn't been degraded enough, things are getting better and better. And you just know that your kids and grandkids are going to have it better than you. It's like, that's just the nature of things. And in decline, if you're born and die into times of decline, well, of course your kids and grandkids are going to have it worse than you. But when you're born in times of expansion, progress, rise, and it shifts in your lifetime, it's suffering until you accept it, until you accept the unstoppability of it. That there's not a single example in human history of any unsustainable civilization on the way down becoming sustainable. It can't be done. But we can sure cause ourselves a tremendous amount of suffering believing it can be done. And we have dozens of examples of that. It turns out that not only is biospheric and civilizational collapse unstoppable, so is denial. And so don't expect people to get it. Don't expect everybody to wake up. Don't expect your friends and your neighbors and relatives to understand or even be able to get their hearts around contraction and collapse. One of the reasons why I was so excited about speaking here is that in Unity, Religious Science, Centers for Spiritual Living, basically the New Thought tradition, some of the core principles, the core understandings are not, as they're sometimes mistakenly understood, that if I just have the right beliefs, it's kind of like, the universe is a slot machine. If I just have the right beliefs and pull that right lever, boom, the blessings of the universe are going to be there for me. No, the core of New Thought is that no matter what happens, through my speech, my internal thoughts, and how I be with the world, I can thrive, and more importantly, I can help others thrive, no matter what shows up. That's the key. And so the first principle that I want to speak about is aligning our expectations with the actual nature of our time. We're not living in a sustainable culture. We're living in an unsustainable boom and bust culture, and we're now on the decline. And so if you have the expectation that everybody's going to get it, that social justice and peace is going to transform the world, and everybody's going to really, you're going to cause yourself and others around you a lot of frustration. And yet that's where all of us in this room, we grew up believing that our activism was really eventually going to transform the world, because we all bought into, it was hard, almost impossible to not, the myth of perpetual progress, the secular religion that things were always going to get better and better. For 12 years, I preached it. My first book, I get to honor. So today is July 17th. 32 years ago today, my wife Allison, who I got married to 40 years ago in Ann Arbor, gave birth at home to Miriam Joy Dowd Eller, married to Trevor Eller, which some of you know. He's the one that actually connected me up here for the first time. And she was born at home 32 years ago. And I dedicated my first book, Earth Spirit, a handbook for nurturing ecological Christianity, to her. So I just want to honor that today's her 32nd birthday. But what I'm reminded of is that my second book, Thank God for Evolution, that got endorsed by 6 Nobel Prize-winning scientists and like 120 religious leaders, a whole bunch of New Thought leaders, I don't recommend it because it has what I now consider hopium. 90% of the book is still great, but there's 10% hopium in there that, it's just like, and hopium is, is a comforting belief of the future that requires breaking the laws of physics, biology, and ecology. It's inspiring thinking about it, but it's ultimately guaranteed to produce crushing disappointment when reality bites. Because when I wrote that book, I still had a Star Trek vision of the future, from the caves to now to the stars. I now know that that was diluted. And yet many of my friends and other colleagues still believe that. I mean, it's a little more difficult since 2016, the election, and then COVID, and it's more and more difficult to maintain this myth of perpetual progress in the last 5 years. But certainly still, we all were born into it. So again, coming back to what about the big picture is it important for young people and grandparents and those of us in the middle to understand? Well, one of them is that we are actually in decline. And when we accept that, we realize we have lots of evidence from many, many dozens of other civilizations that when things contract is when saints, sages, heroes, and sheroes are born. Because A, they don't fight it. They're not saying, this shouldn't be. They say, oh yeah, this is the nature of the times we're living in. And how can I be a blessing? Where can I be a contribution? Where can I look to somebody who's suffering and find some way to alleviate or lessen that, or in some way to be a contribution? Just little small kindness. So the first thing I want to offer to all of us is that there has never been a better time and a more important time to think big and think mythically. And what I mean by mythic is relate personally to reality. Most people they think mythic is untrue or, fantasy or whatever. No. If I relate to the oceans in a personal way, doesn't have to be Poseidon. I relate to the oceans as Oceana. I've personified the oceans as Oceana. I have a mythic personal relationship. For me, God, I don't spell just G-O-D. I spell G, Earth emoji, D. Because any concept of God that doesn't include our biophysical creator, sustainer, and end, the biosphere, the living earth, Gaia, any notion of God that doesn't include that is an ecocidal and ultimately a disempowering notion of the divine. So to live mythically is to realize, or to just basically hold it as a useful belief, if you don't want to hold it literally, that we were made for these times. As I've got a wonderful quote here. Clarissa Pinkola Esty says, do not lose heart. We were made for these times. And this notion, this idea that a child that understands that we're in contraction, that things are going to get harder and harder each week or month or year or whatever. A child that understands that and understands that the very same thing that has given joy throughout all of human history is current now, which is, how can you be a help to someone else? How can you be a contribution or a blessing to someone else? Where can you see someone who's suffering and in some way lessen that suffering? And it doesn't have to be just humans. My wife, Connie, her great work, even if we go extinct in this next few decades, which is certainly possible, her work is helping trees to migrate faster because trees don't have legs. And the passenger pigeon's gone. And so climate is changing so rapidly that tree species can't move fast enough. So it turns out that the difference between dozens, maybe hundreds of species of trees going extinct for sure this century, and many of those same species surviving this century depends 100% on humans assisting them in migrating. That's why her whole work is about assisted migration. If you want to get a quick little overview, just look at the Wikipedia page, Assisted Migration of Forests in North America. There was a whole book that featured her recently. So this idea that it doesn't have to be just humans. Find something in the world where you see a need and then find some way to be a contribution or a blessing or in some way to assist. That's what gives life joy, and that's what gives children's lives joy. Because if they know that things are going to get tougher, they know that things are going to be, contracting, then they're not surprised by it, and then they're just looking for opportunities to be a contribution. Baking some cookies and bring it to a neighbor. Going shopping for a neighbor that can't move very well anymore. Or whatever, there's a zillion ways. So the first thing is to understand that we were born into an unfaithful, unsustainable culture, but that doesn't mean that we can't live faithfully. Not perfectly. None of us is going to live a perfect, sustainable life. And yet the choices that we choose, eating less meat, driving less, flying less, all the different choices that we can make, they're not going to save the world, make no mistake, but they're going to help save your soul. They're going to help you pass the mirror test where you look in the mirror and you don't feel bad about yourself, or you can feel good about yourself. Anything that we can do to be a blessing to any other creatures, even beyond species, is something that children and grandparents can do in times of contraction, because this is unstoppable. The biosphere has been in collapse for 2.5 centuries. Our civilization, industrial civilization, has been in collapse. The stability of the Holocene, which is what allowed civilizations to emerge in the first place, the jet stream doing this, it's now doing this. And so if you're not aware of the possibility that real difficult times are around the corner, and even here now for some people in different parts of the world, we're lucky, we live in Michigan, we can relax, settle in, find our hearts. So I'm loving the music today. And where is that peace, and where can that peace then motivate me to be a contribution and a blessing? And so where I am not clinging for hope, the way I'm being is being hope for someone else. The Serenity Prayer. I love the Serenity Prayer because, you know, we're all addicted to electricity. We're all addicted to a lot of things that civilization provides. I'm addicted to going to shopping for my food. I wouldn't last very long if all of a sudden I couldn't go shopping for food. So we're all, you know, again, my great mentor Thomas Berry used to famously say, I drove a car here to tell you how bad cars are. Right? So it's not about purity, but it is about making choices and trying to be a contribution, accepting the nature of reality. So God, life, reality, grant me the serenity to accept the things that I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. But many people don't know the next line. This was penned by Reinhold Niebuhr in the 1960s. The next line is living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardship as the pathway to peace. Living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardship as the pathway to peace. That is where the New Thought tradition is a step or two ahead of some of the other religious traditions, because we don't have a trivial, inconsequential notion of the divine. The two ways of thinking about God that are most ecocidal and most disempowering, one is that God doesn't exist. The other is that God is merely supernatural. Because again, both of those dishonor our living creator, sustainer, and end, the biosphere. So I see God's local living presence in and through every creature. So let me just wind this down. There are certain benefits that are only possible when we accept what's sometimes known as Teotowaki. I had this up here before, but this is Teotowaki, the end of the world as we know it. Right? And Teotowaki, make no mistake, we're living in Teotowaki. It may not be the end of the world full stop, but we are living at the end of the world as we know it. And so accepting that then allows us to be in that place of accepting the things I cannot change, that the biosphere is in collapse, civilization is in collapse, but that doesn't mean that there's not a tremendous amount of work that we can do that can benefit others and other species and give us tremendous joy and allow our children to have tremendous joy. I mentioned that my daughter turns 32 today. We moved to Ypsilanti, Michigan 2.5 years ago because she has a daughter. We have a 2-year-old granddaughter. Do I think my 2-year-old granddaughter is going to live to be half my age? No way. I hope so, but I don't think so. But I'm committed that she have the best life possible and the most joy and trust as possible. And part of it is my whole family understands that this is the nature. We don't doom scroll. We're not all about feeding doom because we accept this. And once we accept this, then we look for opportunities to practice our religious faith, to practice our ecological faith, to practice being a blessing wherever and however we can to not just other humans, but to other creatures. And sometimes that can mean just building topsoil or whatever. So I want to read 7 benefits that really only come from accepting Teotowaki. Now, I normally would not do a striptease here in a church service, but somebody just bought this for me the other day, and I love it. And I want to honor. All right. With the earth right there at the heart, right? And I want to honor John Reed, who did this as a blessing. He's a brother in this work. But to accept the nature of reality, accepting reality is really a secular way of saying faith in God. Faith in God, accepting the universe, trusting reality, celebrating what's so, cherishing what is. These are all different ways of saying take the nature of reality, find the blessing in it, and find how that can lead you to be a blessing to others. It's not that complicated. So here are 7 benefits that only come, they don't come for people in denial. They don't come for people who are still in that place of what I call the faith in the almighty we. If we all just fill in the blank, if we all just became vegan, if we all stopped flying, if we all stopped having kids, if we all stopped driving, if we all voted for the right people, then, ... good things would happen. That's a tough one to let go of. And yet we find our hearts break open with compassion when we accept this and allow, as Joanna Macy says, the grief that helps us know how in love we are with the body of life. So here are 7 benefits of accepting, trusting what's unstoppable. One is this clarity replacing confusion, compassion replacing blame, because when we don't understand the rise and fall of civilizations, when we don't understand that we can't live out of right relationship to the air, water, soil, and forests upon which we depend, if we don't know that, then we're confused about what's going on, and it's so easy to blame. It's the fossil fuel company, it's the boomers, it's the whoever. And make no mistake, again, as civilizations contract, liberal values tend to predominate on the way up, conservative values tend to predominate on the way down. In groups tighten up, blame and judgment, and we're seeing this all over, and it's unstoppable. That doesn't mean that liberal and progressive and holistic values can't be moved forward. It just takes a little more effort. It doesn't happen effortlessly. And then love and action. Not desperate activism, not fearful activism, because we've accepted the very real possibility that things are contracting and they could contract fast. So clarity, compassion, love, and action. It reminds us of what's most important, which are our families, the relationships, your family here. These are the things that are most important. So attending to what matters most is bringing our energies home locally, and then basically how can we support each other in improving the quality of our lives, and how can we support each other if we are in fact in a terminal state. Because make no mistake, we're part of Homo colossus, which is industrial humanity. It's destined for extinction, but we're part of it. So is it possible that none of us in this room will be alive 10 years from now? Yeah, it's possible. Probably at least a 30% chance, maybe 50%, maybe more. But that doesn't have to be terrifying if we accept that we're all going to die anyway. And so how can we then alleviate suffering and be a contribution? Focusing attention on families, friends, what matters most. And then finally, an overwhelming sense of gratitude. This is the thing. When I was diagnosed with cancer 13 years ago, I thought I could die in the next 8 months. If the chemo hadn't worked, I would have died in the next 8 months. And what I found was that every day I was living with, wow, I'm alive for another day. I can eat another meal. Practicing the gratitude of being alive. And again, the mythic sense that God is with us. We are in God, like nesting dolls. God is that reality outside of us and inside of us. The bacteria are part of God. So, and then that expanded sense of self, that your sense of self doesn't stop with your skin. Your sense of self is actually larger. The universe is your larger self. The divine, God, whatever your name for the divine is, that is part of your larger self. We are not lost even when we die. And so as grandparents, as parents, we can all help. We don't have to feed our kids all the fear stuff and all the doom stuff. That's why most of my life is now devoted to post-doom. Postdoom.com is my main website. Unfortunately, you can't get the post-doom without going through a little doom, because otherwise you're still in denial. And so that expanded sense of identity, and then basically for the rest of my life, whether I live another 1 year, another 5 years, or if I'm graced to live longer than that, what I know for certain is that I can live each day with joy, with gratitude, and with a broken heart as I learn about the suffering of others in the world, and then find those places local where I become aware of suffering, where I can in some way alleviate that and contribute and to be a heart with ears and a heart with hands. May we all grow in our ability to be a heart with ears and a heart with hands, accepting reality, not resisting it, and allowing that to call forth our own greatness and the greatness of our young people. Amen.